Welcome back to a Slice of Empathy podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Wayne Brown, who is an accomplished therapist and educator who specializes in working with individuals and family dynamics. Wayne will bring a deep understanding of current and historical traumas and has also dedicated much of his work to supporting gender nonconformity within families. And with Election Day right around the corner, our conversation couldn't be more timely. We'll be exploring how families can create unity and understanding, even when facing political differences, shifting social dynamics, or even complex identity topics. He'll share his insights on establishing healthy boundaries, raising empathetic children, and building supportive environments where every family feels valued and respected. I'm excited to dive into these critical topics with Wayne and learn more about how we can all come together during times that can challenge us to grow. So let's get started. Hi, welcome in.
Hello, thank you.
So I'm super excited to have you on. So thank you for your flexibility. I really appreciate that. You could tell us a little bit about you, about your background.
Sure. So my name is Wayne Brown. I'm a licensed clinical social worker practicing in Buffalo, New York. I also an educator at University of Buffalo to master social work students. My specialty in practice is family dynamics that encompasses many subsets, including gender and sexuality, addiction, effective communication.
Nice. Appreciate that overview. I also work at a university myself, but I do marketing. Pretty new to it, but I love working within the system. So that's really awesome that you do that as well. So I kind of want to start off with family dynamics and relationships, especially amidst this very challenging political season. I'm curious, is there anything that maybe that you've encountered, especially over the past couple of months, that really sticks out? Anything that you'd like to share?
Well, this is the season challenge for therapists. Typically, the sun's going down earlier, the weather's getting chillier, families are gearing up, preparing, anticipating, to certain degrees, dreading the holiday season. So that's every year, basically. And then every 4 years, we have the extra spice of there is an election, and we are in a situation where, as a nation, I don't think I've ever seen us more divided. That's problematic because, as we saw with the presidential election of 2016, 2020, 2024, there are a lot of very strong emotions around one of the particular candidates.
Right.
Now, I am not saying that any of my clients have preference towards one or the other. I would say my clients have much like the country, my clients have many different opinions on the election. Within family dynamics, can be tremendously complex because when we do have families where there is an issue around gender and sexuality, younger people can identify more with one candidate over the other, and supporting the other candidate is seen as a sort of betrayal to the younger person. And that's not for me to say whether that family member is right or wrong, but it's language that we must communicate on, because the other family member may feel invalidated, may feel the younger person just is too young or doesn't understand, or they're just overreacting, or they're just bop, bop, bop. So when we're in that situation, the biggest issue that we're dealing with is we have a family member who is actively choosing to not hear their younger child or their younger family member. This happens over extended periods of time, you end up in a situation where the younger person stops trying to communicate because they feel their opinions are not heard, are not welcomed, are not appreciated. And when shutdown happens, it's a truly overwhelming dynamic.
Yeah, that's so true. And especially like, I mean, we're just days away from the election at this point, and Thanksgiving is only a few weeks away as well. And I think that whichever way the election goes, it's going to bring even more challenges. And when it comes to families getting together, dinner table discussions, I mean, it's already hard for like so many folks. Like, as you were mentioning, a variety of different topics can come up. And then you have this added layer with this being an election year. What would you advise maybe someone who is like maybe in a family where there are so many different opinions and is wanting to navigate this challenge?
I guess it depends on how big the chasm of communication is. Sometimes the healthiest thing that a person can do is opt to not attend the large family function. If you are a parent of a child who is dealing with gender nonconformity and that is not welcomed, or sexuality nonconformity, or you have a family member who might be struggling with addiction and the primary household refuses to have a dry Thanksgiving. If you have anything that is going to be disruptive of the holiday and you feel that the host family is not being sensitive to your family's needs, and conversely, if you are the host family and there are people who expect to be invited but are not necessarily the best guests, sometimes we have the obligation and we have the right to say, you know what, we don't think that you should attend this year. Don't wait until like the evening before the event if it's avoidable, but your own mental health, either as the guest or as the host, is just as justifiable, just as important as the dominant force in that family dynamic. As family members who identify as non-conforming in one way or the other, we have a history of making ourselves smaller to make ourselves feel less burdensome to the majority voice. And when that happens, we can have a tendency to erase our own identity. And we want to make sure that as family members, not only are we not allowing ourselves to be erased, but we are also encouraging the people who are closest to us to be our advocates, to be our supports, and say, you know what, we're not coming to your Thanksgiving, Uncle Dave, because my child who has they them pronouns is fearful that they're going to be made fun of and belittled. And we would rather have dinner as our family than worry about the welfare of our child's mental health.
Yeah, and I appreciate that you mentioned that. And I think especially as a parent, I think being on the side of your child is going to be especially crucial. And it's interesting. I know my like family, probably like many others, thinking back previous generations would be like there was always that one or two people that maybe caused some sort of disruption or some sort of dysfunction, I should say. And previous generations would be like, well, you just go, you just deal with it and you move on. And I think,
Suck it up and push it down.
yeah, exactly. And that's what I really appreciate about newer generations, millennials and Gen Z, particularly, stepping up and are like, no, I don't want to do this. My time is valuable. why would I want to spend my time, especially, many folks are working long hours. Maybe you have very few days off. Why would you want to spend it maybe being belittled or criticized or whatever it is you're experiencing within your family? Why would you voluntarily do that? And I think there's a new level of awareness that I think is amazing. And it's sometimes challenging because older generations could try to push back on it. And it's really going to be like up to you to kind of like put your foot down. But I appreciate, as you mentioned, like as parents, especially when it comes to gender nonconformity, being able to take that extra initiative to defend your child and not be like, oh, well, so and so, they're just like that, da da da, kind of being dismissive. And, even like in many years previously, previous generations, like I think most families have some sort of dysfunction to some extent. A lot of
Mhm.
times you'll probably hear of someone saying maybe they go to their Christmas or Thanksgiving dinner and someone comments on
Women-
their weight or someone says, why aren't you married yet? Why don't you have kids yet? And now we have these additional things and additional social issues, particularly as well as the upcoming politics. And so I appreciate you mentioning that. And I 100% agree.
Well, and how many people went to family dinners with
Yeah,
their roommate
right.
because it was easier to identify the person that they love most in the world as a roommate rather than explain to their family member in detail at a family meal how they engage in their sexual affairs, which I never understood. But there's this attitude of, well, I don't understand how you engage sexually. Well, why do you want to know? Would you
Right.
ask your straight child how they're having sex with their partner?
Exactly.
And if you are, I feel like that's a you problem.
100%.
I don't think there's anything wrong with us as family members being our loved one's advocate and just say, we do not feel comfortable going to your home. And here's the cool part is you might find out that in your home, you've got a great cook. I know that after the 2016 election, my household voted very differently than my in-laws household. And when Thanksgiving came up, my in-laws family decided to just go on vacation that week. And it was such a relief to all sides because we all didn't want to talk with the other side about the election because I'm not going to convince you you're right. You're not going to convince me I'm right.
Yeah.
Oh, we're going to end up with a whole lot of people with stomach aches. So they went on vacation. We ended up cooking our first Thanksgiving dinner, which was absolutely lovely and has become the family tradition that we do Thanksgiving at our house. And it's wonderful.
Yeah, I love that. And it's interesting because my husband and I, like the last couple of years, have been doing kind of something similar. And previously, for a number of years, we tried to split up between families. And so, what we've kind of been doing now, I don't know if it's like really intentional or not, but I think it also comes down to our time is valuable and we have limited days off and deciding how we want to spend it. And so, like, we kind of decided we'd like to take a road trip. And so, we have a road trip down I live in Sacramento, California, and we're taking a drive down to LA, San Diego area. And, it's a long weekend for us. It's a 4-day weekend. I'm like, I'd much rather like take a road trip rather than go and experience dysfunctional Thanksgiving.
Mhm. Yeah.
um, and
I would imagine driving the
yeah,
PCH is far more relaxing than
yeah.
with your in laws.
Oh yeah, 100%. I'm a foodie. I love food. I love trying different things, but like what we've kind of experimented with is maybe having a small like Thanksgiving dinner like the week before, weekend before, or weekend after, something like that. If we still want to have a semblance of Thanksgiving, but using that actual holiday itself to like do something a little bit different.
I think that's smart. I think that's healthy. But this is the season, Thanksgiving. winter holidays, New Year's, all the way through to Valentine's Day is a therapist super busy time of year.
Yeah.
It's really, for me in working with families, it's about teaching new skills. It's about teaching new language. It's about making it okay to not want to just push it down, to be able to say, Grandma, this is not my roommate. This is my life partner, and we are in love, and that's it. And yes, Grandma's going to have a lot of questions. I am a Generation Xer through and through, and I remember very well the Reagan administration and how sexuality was perceived and how straightness was incredibly valuable. So my generation and older generations sometimes get a bit parochial when it comes to pronouns, when it comes to identifying multiple forms of sexuality and gender. And you might be surprised, given the opportunity, if you explain to your loved one, this person makes me happy. This person is someone who I love, who I want to spend my time with. Some of your family members, yeah, they're not going to be supportive, but some of them will if you give them the opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting because I think most families have to some extent, like divisiveness, especially when it comes to politics. And I think where conversations can also get heated is if you are dealing with something like gender nonconformity, and sometimes it can become political when you're like, well, why would you support a candidate that believes X, Y, and Z? And it could be really become personal. So I think it adds like an extra layer to that conversation.
And it's so much more than gender these days.
Yeah.
Like I'm talking with clients about, hey, when you go to Thanksgiving dinner, you're not allowed to talk about Israel and Palestine, and you're not allowed to talk about the election, and you're not allowed to talk about January 6th, and don't talk about this, and don't talk. The list is getting
Yeah.
very long. And my best advice that I usually use with people who are going to larger family members events is, if you have the benefit of going to a family event where there are young people there and you're sitting at the dinner table and everyone's finished eating, which is usually when the conversation comes out, because when everyone's chewing. But when the conversation starts to happen and you're feeling uncomfortable, you're feeling threatened or challenged or just untoward, you get up from the table and you go play with the kids. And no one's going to get that offended, even if they know what you're doing.
Yeah.
They're not going to get mad at you for engaging with the kids. And if they do, that's kind of a them problem.
Yeah, that's true. And honestly, I think I don't know if it has to do with it, but I know I appreciate when we have things like Friendsgiving kind of coming to the forefront
Right.
somewhat more recent years. And I've been to a few of those and I've loved it. And generally I find that they're respective to, I mean, of course, because you're considering these people friends for a reason, right? They're your chosen family in a way. And I find for me personally, and for many people that I've talked to, that sometimes Friendsgivings can be more enjoyable than the Thanksgivings that they have with their family. And it's also interesting because my husband's family, it's very atypical because like pretty much, I mean, it's not a huge family, about 20 people in total, where everyone pretty much has the same political beliefs. It's very, very atypical. And it's funny, like one of my husband's aunts was saying that like they get comments like, oh my gosh, like it's so rare. Like everyone has like the same political beliefs. Cause I mean, I guess I never really thought about it, but it kind of makes sense. My family is pretty small. And even then, there's been like one or two people like that have had like radically different beliefs. So yeah, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and it's just one of those things that It's a matter of just having the ability to spend time with people who bring you joy.
100%. Yeah, and I think that's what honestly it really comes down to. Like your time is valuable. You should spend it like with those who bring you joy, whether that's your chosen family. If there are some people in your biological family like to get together with, maybe you have a smaller gathering, or you do something entirely different.
Life is short.
Yeah,
Make sure you're getting joy from the things that you do.
100%. I want to pivot a little bit. I want to talk about boundaries. This is one of my favorite topics. And it's interesting. When I was younger, probably around 16 or so, I had come, after seeing a therapist, had come to the realization that after she told me basically boundaries were non existent in my family. I'm like, what does that mean? Now I know what it means almost 20 years later. If you could tell us a little bit about some of the things that maybe you've kind of experienced in terms of boundaries with clients, and maybe I think our listeners could benefit from kind of hearing more about how folks can define boundaries for themselves, parents can define boundaries for themselves and their kids.
Yeah. I think boundaries are crucial for definition. I think boundaries allow individuals to really get to know themselves. What are your boundaries? And for a lot of people, they don't know when you ask them, hey, what is something that is so important to you that if I were to come out and say this was angering me or bothering me in some way, that it would be truly offensive to you? Some people haven't really taken the time to internalize what do they consider their ultimate line in the sand. And that's what boundaries are. It's saying this is where my capacity for civility in conversation ends. And if you cross this line, that I am going to feel the need to advocate for myself. And here's the thing is some people get scared at that at first glance because they've been raised to believe that I live to serve, I live to make sure everyone else is comfortable. It is my job to make sure that I am constantly in the host role, even if I'm not. And having the wherewithal to say, nope, I do not feel comfortable around you. And I am choosing to not give you access to my life.
Yeah, it's very well said. And of course, the boundaries might look different for someone who's maybe a younger child versus a grown child, particularly when it comes to parents. How would you say what might healthy boundaries look like within a family when children are growing up versus maybe a teenager, in particular, versus like maybe an adult child?
One of the things that we have taught our children since they were very, very little, and this is extremely apropos of the holiday season, is that you have bodily autonomy. When you go to a holiday dinner, if you don't want a family member to hug you or kiss you, you have the right to say no, thank you. And the adult has the obligation to honor that. And if they don't honor that, then you still don't have to. And you come and find either myself or my spouse, and we will manage it. We don't want you being rude. We don't want you being disrespectful, but you can politely say, you know what? No, thank you. And if their response is, oh, come on, give uncle, aunt, grandparent, cousin a hug and a kiss. I haven't seen you in so long and I really miss you. And they again politely say no, thank you. And it is refused. If the adult is present, the adult should step in and really say, you know what, Johnny, you don't have to go play. And then the adult can have the uncomfortable conversation. The child is not responsible to have that conversation. That's completely irresponsible. It's inappropriate. It's not something that a child would have the language for. This is the thing that the adult should have the language for. And why is this important at a young age? Because it teaches young people that they have the right to determine who is allowed to have access to them. And this is crucially responsible or important as they get into grade school, as they get into high school, and yes, as they get into college. Because if we don't teach them when they're younger what bodily autonomy means, how the heck do we expect them to understand it when they're in college and their boyfriend or girlfriend is saying, oh, come on, just one more shot. You can do it. So we want to teach them from the youngest age that they have control over who has access to them and who has access inside their brain. So, if grandma is always telling them, you're not as good as your cousin, you have the right to walk away, even if it's impolitely.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's so important because I know so many of us, even like my mom, like she comes from a generation where it's like, okay, as you're mentioning, go hug and kiss grandpa. And she said
Mhm.
she was very uncomfortable with it. And they're like, okay, well, no, that's just what you do, da da da. And I think a lot of times it could be not just a violation of boundaries, but it could be very dismissive because a lot of times children, of course, can come from situations where there might be sexual abuse or something that maybe happened or was involved. Like we may not always necessarily know. And I know, I want to say that that has kind of ended with mine and my brother's generation moving forward. And especially, I think millennials and Gen Z are doing great with this because I remember when I was younger and it wasn't nearly as much as say like my parents' generation where like they were forced to hug and kiss. I would say more so than my brother and I were at family events. But I definitely feel like it is as we got older, it was changing. And I think it's just so important that we teach children to have that autonomy because you're right. As we get older, it's very hard to have those boundaries for ourselves because we didn't have them when we were younger. And so I know, speaking for myself, I really struggled with that. And I'll give an example because my husband's family is they are very much huggers and they've never made me feel uncomfortable in any shape, way, or form. But sometimes I'll feel like I should give them an obligatory hug because everyone else is doing it and I don't want to be that one person. And so that's been something that I've had to try and rectify. And even in my own family too, very huggy. And I've been the one that's like, I'm good. Like if we don't hug or kiss, like I'm okay. And I've been pretty grateful because like with my friends group, I feel like I have identified other people that are kind of similar. We kind of like we wave or maybe handshake or fist bump or something like that. There's not like this feeling of like, okay, I got to go give them a hug, So that's been difficult for me, and I'm sure that many of our listeners can relate as well.
So I do want to build off of what you just said with a story actually from last night. I got home from work last night. Tuesdays and Thursdays are my late night at the office. And when I got home, we have three children, all under the age of 15. When I walked in, the two youngest were crazy bananas, jumping all over me, just give me a hug, give me a kiss. Yeah. And it was great. It was warm, it was loving, it was so wonderful. And I am a hugger and I am a cuddler and I am the cuddler of the home. And the oldest, who's way too cool for the room, is laying on the floor. And I asked them for a hug and kiss. And they just kind of held up their arms like they were, bass in a boat. And I'm like, I've been working for 12 hours. I am not crawling onto the floor for a hug. I was like, when you want to get up, by all means, I would love a hug and a kiss from you. I do not have the ability at this hour to be crawling onto the floor. And they just kind of dead eye looked at me and walked away because my boundaries are just as valuable as theirs. Walk in the kitchen to get myself some dinner, and kiddo walks in, and I say, "Hey, can I get a hug and kiss now?" And they look at me just dead nothing. I'm like, okay, when you're ready, I'm available. And they said, okay. And later on, they eventually did. But it had to be on their terms. It had to be when they were ready for it.
Absolutely. I love that. And I know for me, I think, and I feel like a lot of people too, I think the level of like conditioning that maybe like when we were kids that was put on us. And sometimes, like, for example, like with my husband's family, actually, I don't really mind giving them a hug, but I think part of it for me is okay, I better give them a hug. Otherwise, they're going to be upset with me. And I think it's a logical flaw on my part because they haven't given me any indication that they're actually feeling that way. They've always been super understanding. And I think most people know that I am not like a super big hugger. People are super understanding about it, but I'm like, perceiving it as, oh, I better do it because if not, they're going to be bad. And so I feel like it takes a long time to kind of unlearn that because I think as many kids and many of our listeners have grown up thinking like, oh, you better go and give so and so a hug or kiss, otherwise you might hurt their feelings.
Well, and you know what? If their feelings are that fragile, that's their responsibility, not yours.
Yes, I love that.
And that's part of learning autonomy. That's part of learning healthy boundaries is my crap isn't your responsibility. And if I'm having a hard time managing my emotions because this 7-year old who I see, once every couple of years or once every few months does not wish to be intimate with me, which is what a hug and a kiss is, that's okay. And the child shouldn't be shamed into it. That's the biggest part. And this is something that I deal with a lot of families where the older generation will say, well, I am the grandparent and
Yeah.
I deserve the love and respect of this
Right.
affection with which I request. Sometimes the kid is like, you know what? I don't love them. Or the kid is some other emotion other than excited to give them a hug and a kiss. And all of those emotions, all of the reasons why they don't want to give a hug and a kiss is fair.
I actually like that you mentioned that because I have a similar example. My grandfather growing up, I was very indifferent about him. I didn't really have like very strong feelings one way or another, mostly just because I really hardly ever saw him. But he kind of had, when I did see him, he kind of had this sense entitlement in a way that he wouldn't actually approach us. He would kind of come in, usually sit in the chair and kind of wait. Like it was almost like expected. We go and approach him, give him a hug. It was just really like very strange within like the family. I feel like especially older generations would encourage that. Oh, well, that's just how he is. If you don't give him a hug and you don't initiate it, then he might be upset. So that's something that came to mind. And it's just like, yeah, I hardly ever saw him. Like he was hardly in my life. So I don't really have those warm and fuzzy feelings towards them.
Yeah, that's so much the theme of the holidays is obligation. Yes, we can be obligated to certain things, but let us choose our obligations. If I'm going to make you a pie, or if I'm going to choose to drive 3 hours to your home for the holiday, I'm doing that because I feel desire to. I feel, and maybe it's not that I feel desire to drive 3 hours through the snow, but I have a closeness with my family. I don't get to see them often enough. Maybe I had to move out of town for work. and I miss them and I want to see them and I want to continue this relationship. So I'm going to put myself out there and I am going to do the uncomfortable thing in order to sustain that which is important to me. That is absolutely your right. And it is absolutely your obligation if you choose it. Comma, circling back to where we started this, if your adolescent child does not feel safe, does not feel comfortable, does not feel seen, does not understand why you want them to go see, grandma and grandpa who do not appreciate them or do not honor their life views. Maybe it's not about gender pronouns. Maybe it's about your child is an avid environmentalist and this family will only use styrofoam plates and will never consider the environment and finds the environmental concerns to be poppycock, and the child is like, I do not feel comfortable absorbing that kind of negative emotions for the next 3 days. I want to stay home and go to my friend's house. They have that right. And if the parent has a relationship or the guardian has a relationship with the other family, and the other family is amenable to the child staying there, and it's a safe and warm and pleasant environment, cool. Have a great holiday. We'll see you on Saturday. And this is part of teaching autonomy. And you know what? If your teenager goes to their friend's house and ends up having a crappy time, well, there's a life lesson in there.
Yeah, and I especially think being able to have that autonomy to make that decision, especially as I get older, is especially important. And I know there's like a lot of mixed feelings about that. Oh, well, your parent has you for this holiday, so therefore you should go there. And I think when a child is way young, I mean, I could sort of understand that. But as I get older, they're like preteen, teenager. I mean, they should be able to make that choice. And it's going actually back to my grandfather and as an example, in addition to like him being like absent, he would always just kind of do very, I want to say kind of eccentric things. Like, for example, so there's three total grandchildren. There's my brother and I, and then my cousin. And there was like 1 or 2 years where he, I think, had mailed some cash and gave us each, I think, different amounts. And that I would normally say, like, I don't think that should be a big deal. But his justification was that I was a female, so therefore I was going to get less. And my brother and my cousin, who's 7 years younger than me, are guys and they take women out. So therefore they should get more. It was
Yep.
very
Yeah.
out there.
That is the older generation.
Yeah, very, very out there.
It's a wonder that women who did come up in that felt lesser than.
Yeah.
I mean, yesterday, and for your listeners who don't know their history, I think it's October 29th of 1974 that women were first granted the legal right to own property, to own bank accounts, and to own credit cards without their husband or father signing off. So your civil rights are never more than a generation removed from being lost, as we've
Yeah.
clearly seen.
Yeah, it's interesting because like I was actually just thinking about something similar the other day. And of course, like at the time, I don't remember how old I was, probably like maybe a preteen or something like that. Probably didn't realize. Now I realize like like as you're mentioning it being like generational and like understanding like the history of it, it makes a lot more sense now than it did then. And like back then, I'm like, hey, what the hell?
Right. And that is a generational thing and it's not okay. And you know what? There's still adults that do that today. And it is the parent's job to say to said grandparent, "Mm, no,
Yeah.
everyone gets the same in our house."
Right.
That's part of the conversation. That's part of the engagement.
It's interesting because they say like the boundary is weakest is for you and not necessarily for the other person because you can't really control their behavior. And so you have to remove yourself from it. Have you ever had any instances with any clients where maybe they were in a difficult situation to where they felt like maybe they had to remove themselves like entirely, like leave the event? Has any, if anyone who's maybe facing, I want to say maybe a standoff with a relative and the only option would be for them to leave. Have you ever encountered something like that?
Not only have I encountered that with clients, but I've encountered it with my own life. And it is incredibly uncomfortable and it is incredibly difficult. And unfortunately, it leads the person who is dealing with the issue to have to manage their emotions and their situation way more than they should have to. It puts the onus on the person who's self advocating to continue to self advocate, which is not fair.
Yeah, 100%. Sometimes you could be seen as the bad guy.
Mhm. Absolutely. I have family members who it's funny, I found out after they've passed on and someone will contact me and say, "Hey, so and so just died. Are you going to go to the funeral?" Why would I do that? I believe you that they're dead. I don't need to verify.
Yeah.
I said that one time extremely tongue in cheek, but I also found it unfair that you're now putting the onus on me to decide whether or not my issues are reasonable. Yeah, and I don't think that's fair.
No, I agree. And actually, another example that just came to mind is paternal grandmother had passed away probably back in, I think, 2010. I remember, and this might be somewhat generational too, is that my dad had called when my grandmother had passed away. She was at this point in a nursing care facility. And I remember, I mean, at the time, I didn't really think much of it, but we were in Santa Cruz at the time, and it was about maybe 45 minutes away from where we lived. And so he's like, "Oh, you need to like basically stop what you're doing, come back now to come and say your last words to her." And looking back on that now, I'm like, well, for one, I hate to sound morbid, but she's already dead, you know? And so what is my rushing back now after the fact? What difference does it make? I feel like the
He doesn't care.
right. Exactly. And so in his mind, the expectation was, okay, you need to come back and see her and say goodbye to her. And when my other grandmother, my maternal grandmother, passed away back in 2000, I think 16, I chose, I mean, because my mom's family, like they're pretty understanding about it. I'm like, I don't need to see her body. Like as you were saying earlier, I'm like, I believe you. And I'd rather not that not be my last memory of her. And but I didn't have that. I felt like that choice was kind of taken away from me. And I was a much younger adult then and didn't really have those boundaries in place to be like, I don't need to see her body. It was very traumatic. And my husband was with me as well. I mean, he had lost his dad when he was pretty young, and he said it was brought back memories for him and like
Right.
seeing her like that. And I'm like, I'd rather remember her for, I don't want that to be my last image of her implanted into my brain. And
And you can handle those in different ways. I had to
yeah,
go to a funeral or a wake, what was it, on Sunday. My dear friend, who I actually consider to be to be the most sister that I have, her father passed at 83 years of age. Because I'm so close to the family, I chose to go to the wake.
yeah,
I didn't go to the casket because I had fond memories of him. And you're
yeah,
right, I didn't want to impress onto my brain this embalmed meat suit that is not the person who I cared about. So I stuck by and I talked to friends and I talked to loved ones and we exchanged wonderful stories and we laughed and we remembered and then we went our separate ways and it was lovely.
Yeah, I love that. And when my husband's grandfather passed away, and his grandmother too, I think they were both cremated. They had a nice memorial, and I'm sure if he wanted to maybe see her body, he could. But I've always admired his family in the way that they are very respectful of people's boundaries, I want to
Mhm.
say, and just respectful in general. And I think that honestly, that's how it should be. If maybe you would like to, offer your parting words and make it more of an option rather than like, no, you have to, is essential. And so for
Right.
anyone listening, hopefully you can
Yeah,
take that
hopefully
experience.
the loss is not horrible to you, and understanding that your loved ones may not mourn the same way you do. And that doesn't mean that they don't have affection for the person who passed. That doesn't mean that they don't have love and respect for you. It means that it is part of their boundary that going to something that is not always the most trauma informed
Yeah.
is not how they're choosing to remember your loved one. And that's not a judgment on you. It's not a judgment on how you celebrate their lives. It's their own personal value. And you can, get together and you can have a brunch or a memory celebration where you sit back and talk about the loved one and the funny and quirky ways they acted and behaved without making it mandatory that everyone grieve as you choose to.
Yeah. And I think that's so spot on because my mom and I have had this conversation and she's been respectful of my choice, even though she's a little bit different in the fact that, like, for her, she said for her, seeing the person after they pass, seeing their body is like a way of closure for her, which I respect because she's like respected that. So I think that respecting each other's wishes is something that's so important.
Right. This is really, I think, the theme that we kind of struck into today is really acknowledging just because your values are not the same as mine does not make me right or wrong and does not make you right or wrong. It's my life experience is my life experience, and it's not judgment on you. Yours is yours. I'm not going to pass judgment on yours. I don't want you to pass judgment on mine. Let's just, if we choose to spend the holidays together, if we choose to spend time together, that is sometimes the acknowledgement enough that we are connected. And if there is more acknowledgement than just sharing the same air, then it's based on terms that are mutual for everyone. And be nice
Comprehension.
to your teens and your children. They actually have a lot of brilliant insights. If you're the older generation, and I know I'm part of the older generation, but we can get so pompous and self righteous. Really stopping and listening to the younger people just because we disagree or just because we have a different approach does not make either side right or wrong. Having a different opinion is not a threat to your opinion. It's a different value system.
Yeah. And as kind of like I like to say it is it's all subjective.
Mhm. As a parent of three children, I can tell you that all three of my children are incredibly different individuals. So, if all three of my children, and I'm sure everyone in here who has multiple children can identify, all of our children have our own personalities, even if they grew up with the same parents in the same home, in the same circumstance for the entirety of their childhood. If your children growing up in the same environment can have such vastly different personalities and life perspectives and value systems, why is it that there can only be one perception that the older generation can manage? It's time that we help our youth find their voice to self advocate if they do not know how to do it themselves.
Oh, absolutely. And even in my like speaking from experience in my own family, we're all so very different. And sometimes I like to joke with my folks. I'm like, I'm surprised some days. I'm like that you two are my parents. Which sometimes we're just my brother too. Like, and sometimes I'm like, wow, I'm surprised you're my brother. And I'm sure he's probably thinking the same thing as me because we're all very different.
Right. It's just incredibly important to acknowledge that. And it doesn't make it right or wrong. It just makes it what it is, giving people the space to be who they are.
Yeah. And I think that's a great spot to leave our listeners with. And this has been such a wonderful conversation. So many subjects that I just love to explore. And if you could take a moment to let our listeners know where they can maybe find you, learn more about you and what you do.
Yeah. My website is willowgrovecounseling.net. That's WILLOW Grove, GROVE, counseling, COUNSELING.net. We're also on Instagram and we're also on Facebook. And I do mental health counseling, clinical counseling in the state of New York, but I also do parent coaching anywhere.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll make sure I get those down in our show notes. That way our listeners can connect with you.
I can
Thank you so
also
much.
do adult, interactive adult life coach
Nice.
as well.
Okay, very cool.
But since we've been focusing on the childhood aspect, that's where my brain.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you. It's been a lovely conversation.